Welcome to Ask a Pastor. It's great to have you along today. This is a podcast we developed a few months ago just as a way to interact with questions that you may have. And we've been really encouraged by how many questions have come in. So thank you for that. And please continue just to send questions that you have to askapastor@orchardhillchurch.com. We'll be sure to interact with it in the future. And if you have been getting this content via podcast, if you take a few moments and give this a couple of stars, maybe several stars if you like it, that helps people find the content. If you're listening on the radio or Facebook, Instagram, wherever else this content's out there, Facebook, welcome. We're glad you're along today. Today I'm joined by Dan Shields. Welcome, Dan. Dan has been our worship leader / pastor here at Orchard Hill since 1999, which I was just kidding him a minute ago. I think I was in middle school at the time, which is actually not true. But one of the joys I have here at Orchard Hill is some of the people I get to work with, both on staff and just as part of the church. And Dan is one of those people that it's just been a joy for me to work with for so many years together, and to have the longevity that Dan has been able to give to our worship ministry has been great. So Dan, one of the questions that we had was a question concerning this immigration issue, specifically the whole immigration train of people that's headed to the U.S. border. And obviously this becomes politically divisive, where you get people who start to line up on one side of the aisle and say, this is God's take on this, and people who line up on the other side saying, this is God's take on this. So how should a Christian person, I think this is really what was behind this question, how should a Christian person or a church respond to the issue of immigration, but specifically even this group of people that's headed to our border, and how should we view that?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question, and first of all, the question itself shows compassion. This person obviously cares, and they have empathy towards what's happening, I think, in here, and that's an important thing. I think I want to approach this question a couple ways, though, because I think it's easy to take a surface look at this. But I think we have to look at maybe 4 different areas that really get the holistic view of how the church should deal with this in the question. Otherwise, we can sort of deal improperly and just respond emotionally. And it's not bad to have emotions. God created us with emotions. We should have empathy. We should have care and compassion. But we also want to be effective in what we do. So I think the first thing is this, and this is a really important thing, that the church itself needs to respond to people who are hurting. That's one of our calls, I mean, you look at Jesus and, he said, whatever you do unto the least of these, you've done unto me. And, his ministry itself, he healed the sick, the blind saw, the lame walked, the sick were healed, he fed the hungry, he cared about the children, he cared about the outcasts and people who were, maybe on the outside. And I think we as a church, we also need to have that compassion and care. That's a charge of the church. And, you look at the early church, and some of the things that were most important to them were caring for widows, caring for orphans, caring for the poor, caring for sojourners, people who were outsiders. We'd call them immigrants. So the church was called to do those things. And, you look at the writings of John or Peter or Paul, and they all dealt with these things and said that they were very important. You're teaching a series on the book of James right now, and there's a whole section in that book about caring for the least of these. And I think if we look at the church historically, even if you were the most hardened critic of the church, even if you're really skeptical, you don't like the church at all, if you just look historically, you have to come to the conclusion that the church historically, more than maybe any other organization that the earth has ever seen, has shown compassion and benevolence to the least of these. The George Muellers or the Mother Teresas, they care and they have compassion. So I think that's the first point's an important one.
Okay, good. What else do you have?
Well, the second point, though, I think is equally as important, and that's that the church needs to be careful and prayerful in how they deal with these issues. The reality with the press and the way the press is, and I'm not saying fake news at all, this is not what I'm saying, but the press does have a tendency to sensationalize. They want viewership. If it bleeds, it leads. Whatever the biggest thing that's going on, they want to be on that bandwagon because they want viewership. And a lot of times, they portray things very emotionally. One caution I would say with that, though, is just because something is the relevant thing that's happening right now, it doesn't mean that there's not other really challenging issues. So for instance, the immigration thing, this is a very serious deal. We should care about this. But so is starvation in Haiti, right? If you have a starving child, that's a serious issue. Or child slavery in India, that's a very serious issue. Or the AIDS epidemic in Central Africa. So I think we need to be cautious of how we approach these things. And if we just emotionally jump from whatever the press is leading us to see as the most important issue, we might miss some really core key issues, and we might not be as effective with our time, talent, resources as we could be. So just to take this into a personal example, I walk down the street, I see some poor soul on the side of the street, he says he's hungry, and I hand him a $10 bill. Now that's a good thing, right? Everybody would agree that's a good thing, that's good and right. But we have a partnership, for instance, here at the church with Light of Life Ministries. If I talk to somebody from Light of Life, they would say that was a kind and gracious thing to do, but that wasn't the best use of $10. With that $10, we could have fed 4 people, not just one person. You also don't know what's going to happen to that $10. You don't watch how that happens. But if you give to us, we do watch what happens. And furthermore, they develop relationships with people that help to get them out of those situations. They're not just dealing with, I need a hamburger in my stomach, but how do you deal with homelessness? How do you deal with mental health issues? And that's through relational things and also, them giving some real support. So I think that's important.
That's good. That's well put. And I like how you say that, be careful and prayerful. One of the things that it seems to me happens in the broader church context today is that people, whether, as you said, being led by the news or whatever, they'll see something and they'll say, this is the Christian response. And anybody who doesn't respond with the same intensity, the same sense of urgency that I have is somehow less Christian or less spiritual, less passionate about the things of God. And I think your point is well made to say every need is not a calling necessarily, because you may have several things that you're concerned about, passionate about. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a take on something, but it means that every time somebody says, I'm passionate about this and this is an important thing, that doesn't mean that you have to jump into that and say, this is also my thing. So what I'm hearing you say is the church should care about people who are marginalized. There's biblical exhortations to care for the sojourner, the foreigner as a country, but also be careful and prayerful. What else?
Yeah, just to bounce back on what you just said, though, that I think is really important. We have a saying that we've used here. I don't think it's original to this church, but we say it's better to hit a nail on the head 10 times than 10 nails one time. It's important for us, I think, to be able to make wise choices with our resources, because there are so many problems and we cannot solve all the issues of the world. And the reality is we live in a broken world. There are going to be crises. If the church today solved all the crises of the world today, tomorrow there would be another crisis. Right. So we have to pick and choose our battles and decide how we're going to spend our resources and our time. So I think that's important. Yeah. So the third thing I think that's really, to me, I would say is the single most important thing. Some people would disagree with that, but from my perspective, my vantage point, I think this is the single most important thing. And I would say this, that even though we are called to serve the poor, and that is important, and that's part of the mission of the church, it's not our primary mission. If you see the world through the goggles of charity first, you put on the glasses of charity, you might miss the more important thing, which I think is what the church is really designed to do, which is share the gospel of Jesus Christ. I feel like, Kurt, if we miss that, we've missed everything. We've missed the whole world, because the gospel is letting people know who they are, what sinfulness means, who a holy God is, and how Jesus Christ has paid a price so that we can have a relationship with the God of the universe. That changes everything. That changes our perspective on things. That helps us with, God's Spirit will flow through us and He'll lead and guide us to be able to help people. But, I feel like some churches get this backwards. Well-intended churches that I love and I appreciate, but they get it backwards and they become more of a charitable organization than a gospel organization. And to me, what that does, it's a little bit like this. If you're a doctor and you see cancer on somebody's arm and it hurts them, and you just simply numb that cancer, knowing all the way, wow, that cancer is going to spread and kill that person, we would call that malpractice. I mean, you've actually done a great disservice to that person. You've helped the pain, but you have not cured the problem. The reality is if we, we take one of these precious kids that we see that's really hurting on this caravan, our heart goes out to them. Our heart should go out to them. But if we take that kid out of that situation, we clothe them, we feed them, we educate them, we put them through college, they end up becoming great citizens, they have a house and they have a car and they have a family and a dog and live a great life, but they die and they don't know Jesus. What have we done? We essentially have just prolonged the worst thing that could happen in somebody's life, and that's an eternity separated from God. And I think we've missed everything if we miss that. So I think we have to know that our charge, first of all, is as sharing the gospel. And then there's a lot of other things that the church needs to do, and charity is another one.
So a lot of people would hear that and would say, okay, I hear your point about the cancer and the, numbing the pain, but they would critique your viewpoint that you just shared by saying you're making a false dichotomy of saying the gospel and acts of charity aren't one and the same. What they would say is if you are infused with a gospel passion, it will equally help you to do works and word, deeds and word, and they go hand in hand. And in order to have credibility in the broader world, don't we need to do acts of charity that communicate to people we're for the good of the world, and here's the gospel? How would you respond to that critique?
I would agree wholeheartedly with them, first of all. So I think they're right. And basically what I'm saying is not one to the exclusion of the other, but I'm saying that the primary driver of the church has to be Jesus and what he's done. And that's the primary thing that the church is really designed to do. So it's not the exclusion of something else. We're called to love everyone. So do you share the gospel and not love people? Well, no, of course not. Of course we're to show compassion and love and grace and kindness to people. That's what the charge of the gospel is, and that should be the heart change that happens within in us. And if we don't see that, again, you're going through the book of James, if you don't see those things happen, you do have to question, where really is your faith? So I think faith naturally outpours into all of those things. But there's a lot of different social issues that are very pressing, serious issues. You could look at abortion or something like that. And those things, if they become the primary thing, I think something goes wrong. But if you see the gospel as the primary thing and the outpouring of those things into all of these other areas of society, I think we get it right. Okay.
Now, what's your last point on this?
The last thing, and I would say this, and this is an important one. The person's asking, what should the church do? Well, that's a good question. And, the church is two different things, and I think this is important to realize. The church is the church visible, which is the buildings, the denominations, whatever it is, but it's also the individual people. It's the church invisible. It's you and me, actual believers. And, we have a charge to really listen, just like that second thing I said, be prayerful and careful. That's what that person needs to do. And I would say this. There are different levels of response that God will call us to in certain things. And it's okay not to respond to the full measure of these things. But the first level, I would say, is just empathy or compassion. You see this horrible thing happening, and it should break your heart. You should feel something, and it's good to feel something. But if that's the end of it, you really have done nothing to solve the problem. You've done nothing. You've just felt something, which is okay. That's a first step towards something. The second step, I'd say, is a step of awareness, where you start sharing with other people. You find out about the issue more. You talk and say, isn't this a horrible thing? Maybe you post it on Facebook or something like that. Now, again, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But the reality is that still has done nothing to alleviate the problem. So the question you have to ask yourself, if you feel this sort of like divine dissatisfaction, I heard a pastor say, you need to be prayerful and ask the question, what am I being called to do? Am I being called to give resources? Am I being called to help somehow? What is my, it's the JFK thing, ask not what your church should be doing, ask what you should be doing. And you have to ask that question. And if you think your church should be involved, I'd say go to the leadership of the church. Tell them this is a passion of yours, and ask if there's a way that you could partner together with the church. But remember too, the church might have a lot of other areas that are just as important, and they might not do something with it.
Well, a lot of times what happens in my role is people come and say, what's the church doing about X?
Yes.
And I probably get that question almost every weekend. Why aren't we doing this? We should do this. And my standard answer is, you are the church.
Right.
Go do it. And what people often mean is, well, can't we make an announcement? Can't we rally everyone here? And to your point, there's only so many causes you can rally to Otherwise,
Right.
you'd be constantly saying, hey, we're rallying to everything. But if you have a passion for something, you are the church, and you
Yes.
doing something is a response of the church. And so that's a lot of times people want the institution to do something instead of saying, I can do something, and
Right.
me doing something is that response. So,
Yeah, agreed.
so I appreciate your perspective. Let me push just for a second
Sure.
on this issue. So if somebody were to say the biblical thing is to care for foreigners, sojourners, our country's closed borders is an anti-biblical policy. If you stand with that, how would you respond to that?
Yeah.
And just for fairness, I didn't tell him I was going to ask that question, so he's on the spot.
Okay,
here.
so I mean, we've walked a little bit into the world of politics
Yes,
right now.
but it's merged because people throw down this
Certainly.
is a biblical ideal. So
Certainly.
that's
And
why I'm asking the question.
I would say this, that they probably are right. Here's one caution that I would have, though. The political landscape right now is a highly charged political landscape. It probably always has been, but we see that especially with the press right now. And what is often portrayed in the world of politics are the extremes of politics, because again, they're the things that gets the most press. So it used to be, I think, that the means were defined by ideas on both sides coming together and seeing where that middle ground is. Now I think the means are largely defined by the loud vocal extremes of politics. But I'd say this, that a lot of times in the political world, there is more middle ground than people think. So I'll give you an example. In this particular case, you have two sides of the fence. One might say, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. You can't let everybody come in and take everything of yours, just like you have a front door on your house with a lock on it. You don't invite all the homeless of the world into your house because it would bankrupt your house and you wouldn't have a house anymore. Both sides would agree with that, though. On the other side, you have a side saying, but we are a country of immigrants. We were built as immigrants, and we should have compassion for people and care for people, and we've always been a country that has had that, and we should have that now. But both sides agree with that. So the question really is, how do you deal with the disparity in views that both people agree with? There's a gray zone between those two things that you have to decide, okay, what does it look like to protect our borders? And what does it feel like to really care about people who are in need in the world? And those are the questions that I think are the important questions. Yeah. But I don't think you ever wanted to exclude somebody else's view completely, because a lot of times the people on the opposite side of the fence, if you can look them eye to eye and not just write something caustic on Facebook or something, you probably can hear some things that you say, that's true and I agree with. But I think I have some important viewpoints here too that play into this that are really important for us as a country. And to be able to have a civil discourse is something this country has largely lost. Even statesmanship with politicians, I think, is largely lost. And that's an unfortunate thing. But as we learn to dialogue and talk, we can start to see that other people have valid points too, and then you can work through real solutions that really do impact the situation.
Yeah, it seems like part of the problem comes when we assume that there's no nuance, no possibility for smart, reasonable people to disagree or to see a different solution.
Yes.
And then what we tend to do is we tend to impugn the motives of the people and
absolutely.
say those people on the other side clearly don't understand or clearly have malintent.
Yes, and we'll label them. They're haters or they're socialists or we'll actually put labels on those things that might not really be true with the reality of what the person sees and feels.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, another question that we had, thank you for your thoughts on that, is how should I address my doubts about God and the Christian faith? So if somebody were to come to you and just say, I've been around kind of this church thing, God thing, but I still am full of some questions and doubts, how would you advise that person to handle those doubts or questions?
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably three things that are important. First of all, I love the question because built into the question is somebody saying, they have spiritual desires, but they have real legitimate doubts. And first thing I'd say is everybody has real legitimate doubts. Billy Graham had real legitimate doubts.
He doesn't now.
He pretty much knows now, yeah. But everybody who has any set of beliefs, you always question those beliefs, whether you're Christian or not. So you've lived the Christian life for decades now, and there are probably times in your life where you've had real legitimate questions in your faith. So that's no surprise that people have doubts. Everybody struggles with those doubts. What you do with those doubts is really the key. The first part that I'd answer is an easy answer. This is the answer that you would expect. And the answer that you'd expect is this, that we have 2,000 years of church history with great thinkers who have thought through many of these issues before. And there is, at the click of your phone or, buy a book, and you can get real answers to real questions. Like I talked to somebody here. He was a young kid, and he stepped off of a team that we were on, and he said, I don't believe what we're saying, and I'm an atheist. And my first response to him was, that's great. And he was shocked, because I don't think it's great that he was an atheist, of course. I want him to be a believer in Christ. But I said, it's great that you no longer are just simply believing what the church says, what your parents said, because the reality is there are no grandchildren in Christianity. There's only children, and you have to own your faith for yourself. So he needs to go out and ask those hard questions and get the answers to those hard questions. And I will say this, if God's a God of truth, he is not scared about the hard questions. But if you just look online, you look at some of the great apologists, maybe you get a book like Reason for God by Keller, or Mere Christianity, or one of the other myriad of great books that are out there that deal with those issues of apologetics and faith. Or you jump onto a podcast by Norman Geisler or Ravi Zacharias or Hank Hanegraaff or somebody who deals with apologetics all the time. You can get a lot of those answers, right. and that's the simple part of the answer. I'd say the more complex part of the answer is this. And I'll give you an example on this. I heard a pastor, I was just reading an apologetics book, this was a couple years back, and I had read some fairly complex issues of the faith, and somebody answered them really well. And I overheard a conversation where this guy asked one of these questions. And I just happened to be sitting in my back pocket on 20 great answers for this thing, but I wasn't in the conversation, and so I didn't say anything, but I was sort of like listening out of the corner of my ear or whatever it is, and the pastor said something that shocked me. He said, well, the reality is we all have to believe something, and you have to choose what you're going to believe, and you either have to have faith or not. And I remember my response when I heard that was actually like, I was shocked, and I thought like, but don't you know the answers to how could you say that? How could you but when I walked away from that conversation, as I thought more about that, I came to realize that was a very, very wise thing for him to say, because there is some reality into we're going to make choices of faith in one direction or another. And as we make a choice of faith, it won't matter all that much. You can't win an argument to get somebody into the faith. You can't, or even more so, you can't make somebody lose an argument to get into the faith. So I think you have to decide, am I going to start with a position of faith and say, I'm going to find the answers legitimately or not?
And so maybe what he was communicating is that in some ways, our doubts speak to our beliefs, but in some ways, our beliefs inform our doubts.
Exactly.
And that's probably an important thing to understand, is that sometimes we don't want the implications of the Christian faith, and so we have doubts rather than having intellectual doubts. Now, having said that, I don't think it's entirely fair, because sometimes there are real intellectual doubts that people have. And one of the things that's at least been helpful for me is to just be able to say it's okay to realize that faith is not the absence of doubt, but faith is affirming something in the presence of doubt. And what I mean when I say that is just to be able to say there's very few things that we have complete assurance in, and yet somehow when it comes to spiritual things, we want better assurance than we want when we go to get on an airplane or something, that there's qualified people flying the airplane, or whatever it is that is our standard. And so that's not an easy question. The other thing I would say to anybody who's struggling with doubts is take the time to investigate. You mentioned some books. I think a lot of times it's easy to say, well, I'm just a doubter, I'm just a skeptic, and to sit there.
Yes.
But to say, if I am doubting, questioning, study the stuff, resolve the stuff, and land somewhere, even if you're saying, I'm landing here for now, because that will force you to try to actually say, what is it that I think today? Because sometimes and I think this is what you were saying even about the beliefs kind of leading to doubts, sometimes it's a comfortable place to be. If I don't land my beliefs, then I don't actually have to commit to anything. And therefore I can just kind of go through life without the implications of saying I'm an agnostic, I'm atheist, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Christian, whatever it is. But if you land, then you have implications. So so great. Well, Dan, thank you for jumping in today. Again, if you have questions, please send them to askapastor@orchardhillchurch.com, and we'll look forward to interacting with those in a future podcast.